Hello and join us as we go live to the United Nations General Assembly in its fifth day of debates. Let's listen.
A million people fell victim to the fighting, famine and disease. In 1945, the course of world history changed forever. The triumph over German Nazism, under whose banner most of Europe had rallied, and Japanese militarism paved the way for peace, recovery and prosperity. This year, Moscow and Beijing held celebrations devoted to the 9th of May and 3rd of September holidays to mark the victory in the Great Patriotic War and World War II. The world witnessed grand military parades commemorating the decisive contribution of the peoples of the Soviet Union to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the particular role of the people of China in defeating militaristic Japan. We sacredly honor the memory of our brotherhood in arms with all of our allies who stood on the side of truth in the fight against the forces of evil. One of the enduring outcomes of that war was the creation of the United Nations. The principles of its charter, agreed upon by the founding fathers of our organization, continue to serve as a shining beacon of international cooperation. They embody centuries of experience of the coexistence of states and remain fully relevant in the age of multipolarity. The only thing that remains is for all member states, without exception, to adhere to those principles in full, in their entirety, and as they are interconnected. In practice, however, things look different. Widespread, gross violations of the principle of the sovereign equality of states are undermining faith in justice itself and leading to crises and conflicts. The root of the problem lies in the incessant attempts to divide the world into us and them, into democracy and autocracy, into a blooming garden and a jungle, those who are at the table and those who are on the menu, into the chosen ones who are allowed everything and the rest who for some reason are obliged to serve the interests of the golden billion. We advocate for unquestioning adherence to the principle of equality. It is the guarantee that all countries will be able to take their rightful place in the world order, regardless of their military might, the size of their population, or the size of their territory and economy. The principle of the non-use of force and threat of force has also been repeatedly flouted by the West. The NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, the invasion of Iraq by the US-led coalition, and NATO's military operation for regime change in Libya all ended in tragedy. Today, Israel's illegal use of force against the Palestinians and aggressive actions against Iran, Qatar, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq threaten to blow up the entire Middle East. Russia firmly condemned the attack by Hamas militants on Israeli civilians on the 7th of October 2023. However, there is no justification for the brutal killings of the civilian population of Palestine or for terrorist attacks. There is also no justification for the collective punishment of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, where Palestinian children are dying from bombing and starvation. Hospitals and schools are being destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people are being left without shelter. There is no justification for plans to annex the West Bank. We are essentially dealing with an attempt at a kind of coup d'etat aimed at burying UN decisions on the creation of a Palestinian state. Recently, a number of Western governments announced their recognition of the State of Palestine. Moreover, they announced their intention to do so several months ago. The question then arises, why did they wait so long? It seems that they had hoped that soon, by the time the General Assembly session was convened, there would be nothing and no one left to recognize. The situation requires urgent action to prevent such a scenario, which was strongly advocated by the participants at the high-level international conference on Palestine. The strikes on Iranian facilities under IAEA safeguards deserve condemnation, as do the strikes on the capital of Qatar at a time when negotiations with Hamas were being held there with the participation of American mediators, among others. Yesterday, in the Security Council, the West rejected a rational proposal by China and Russia to extend the 2015 agreement on Iran's nuclear program in order to allow time for diplomacy. This has finally exposed the West's policy of sabotaging the pursuit of constructive solutions in the UN Security Council and its desire to extract unilateral concessions from Tehran through blackmail and pressure. We consider such a policy to be unacceptable and consider all manipulations to restore anti-Iranian UN sanctions as well as the sanctions themselves to be illegal. The West is not accustomed to observing the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. The color revolutions have become a sad phenomenon of our time, and illegal unilateral sanctions have long since become the main tool of Western diplomacy. No matter what excuses are used to justify them, the essence of such sanctions is the same: to suppress and intimidate competitors in the global economy and politics. Russia, together with an absolute majority of UN members, calls for the immediate lifting without prior conditions of the trade blockade against Cuba, which has been in place for more than 60 years, and for it to be removed from the notorious list of state sponsors of terrorism. We express our solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the face of external sanctions pressure and threats. We advocate for Latin America and the Caribbean to remain a zone of peace and cooperation. A flagrant example of the undermining of sovereignty and gross interference in internal affairs is the actions of the West in the Balkans, where such a fundamental principle as the need for all UN members to comply with Security Council decisions is being violated. The unilateral recognition of Kosovo's independence, contrary to Resolution 1244, was essentially an attack on Serbia's state structure. Now the West has set a course for the collapse of the statehood of Bosnia and Herzegovina by sabotaging the Dayton peace agreement. In both Kosovo and Bosnia, an attack has been launched on the vital interests of the Serbian people, including the ancestral rights of Serbian Orthodoxy. Similarly, the Kiev regime, which seized power as a result of an anti-constitutional coup organized by the West in 2014, has set a course for the elimination of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the legislative eradication of the Russian language in all spheres, in education, culture, and the media. Ukraine is the only country in the world that has legislatively banned the use of the native language of almost half of its population. Arabic is not banned in Israel, and Hebrew is not banned in Arab countries and Iran, but Russian is banned in Ukraine. Let me remind you that Article 1 of the UN Charter states the need for respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Europe remains silent on this issue, as it is the Ukrainian goal of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. To this end, the Ukrainian regime is permitted to do anything, including terrorist attacks against politicians and journalists, torture, extrajudicial executions, indiscriminate bombings of civilian targets, and reckless sabotage of nuclear power plants. As President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly emphasized, Russia has been and remains open to negotiations on eliminating the root causes of the conflict. Russia's security and its vital interests must be reliably guaranteed. The rights of Russians and Russian-speaking people in the territories that remain under the control of the Kiev regime must be restored in full. On this basis, we are ready to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. So far, neither Kiev nor its European sponsors seem to realize the gravity of the situation or to be willing to negotiate honestly. The North Atlantic Alliance continues to expand right up to our borders, contrary to assurances given to Soviet leaders to advance not a single inch to the east. Contrary to the commitments made by NATO members at the OSCE to respect the principles of the indivisibility of security and not to strengthen their own security at the expense of others and not to strive for dominance, we repeatedly propose that NATO capitals respect their commitments and agree on legally binding security guarantees. Our proposals in 2008 and the subsequent ones, including in December 2021, have been ignored and continue to be ignored to this day. Moreover, threats of the use of force against Russia are increasingly being made. Russia is being accused of almost planning to attack the North Atlantic Alliance and the European Union countries. President Putin has repeatedly debunked these provocations. Russia has never had and does not have any such intentions. However, any aggression against my country will be met with a decisive response. There should be no doubt about this among those in NATO and the EU, who not only are telling their voters that war with Russia is inevitable and are forcing them to tighten their belts, but are also openly talking about preparations for an attack on our Kaliningrad Oblast and other Russian territories. We have some hopes for the continuation of the Russian-American dialogue, especially after the summit in Alaska. In the approaches of the current US administration, we see a desire not only to contribute to ways to realistically resolve the Ukrainian crisis, but also a desire to develop pragmatic cooperation without adopting an ideological stance. Russia and the US bear a special responsibility for the state of affairs in the world and for avoiding risks that could plunge humanity into a new war. The maintenance of strategic stability is the aim of a new initiative by the Russian Federation that was put forward by President Putin on the 22nd of September. It concerns Russia's readiness to adhere to the central quantitative limits of the New START treaty for 1 year after its expiry on the 5th of February 2026. This is upon the condition that the United States acts similarly and does not take steps that would violate the existing balance of deterrence capabilities. We believe that the implementation of our proposal would create the conditions necessary for avoiding a strategic arms race, to maintain an acceptable level of predictability in the nuclear missile sphere, and to improve the overall atmosphere in Russian and American relations. Colleagues, in December this year, we will mark the 65th anniversary of the adoption by the General Assembly of the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Peoples and Countries. The decolonization process, with a leading role played by the Soviet Union, was a direct consequence of the realization of the right of nations to self-determination. The peoples of Africa and Asia refused to live under the yoke of the colonizers, just as after the coup d'etat in 2014 in Ukraine, Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya refused to submit to the Kiev neo-Nazi regime that had illegally seized power. It not only does not represent the interests of the population, but has also unleashed a war against them. In both cases, the principle enshrined in the 1776 Declaration of Independence and subsequently reaffirmed by many American presidents was put into practice. The following principle: governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Neither the colonizers nor the Kiev regime had any consent from the peoples that they sought to rule. This principle was also unanimously reaffirmed in the UN 1970 Declaration, which states explicitly that all must respect the territorial integrity of those countries whose governments represent the entire population living on the territory concerned. Today, Africa and the entire Global South are experiencing a new awakening, striving for complete independence, and the UN must not be indifferent to that. Last December, the General Assembly resolution entitled Eradicating Colonialism in All Its Forms and Manifestations was adopted. We call for the next step to be a decision to declare the 14th of December the International Day for the Elimination of Colonialism. We welcome the role of the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter in consolidating efforts to counter neo-colonial and other discriminatory practices against the global majority, and we invite all independent states to join the membership of that initiative and that group. The current balance of power in the world is radically different from that established 80 years ago. The decolonization process and other major upheavals have changed the political map of the planet. The global majority is loudly asserting its rights. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS play a special role as mechanisms for coordinating the interests of the countries of the Global South and East. The influence of the African Union, CELAC, and other regional associations is growing. These new realities have not yet been adequately reflected in our organization's institutional framework. The issue of Security Council reform is particularly important. Russia calls for its democratization exclusively through the expansion of the representation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We support the application of Brazil and India for permanent seats on the Council, while at the same time correcting the historical injustice towards Africa within the parameters that have been agreed by the countries of the continent themselves. Recently, Secretary General Antonio Guterres proposed a comprehensive reform of the UN. We are not opposed to an open discussion of this initiative. The guiding principle should be the UN's return to the fundamental principles enshrined in its charter, which the West for many years has been seeking to replace with its rules-based order. It's important that the work be carried out transparently, with the participation and consideration of the interests of all member states. We call on the Secretary General and all Secretariat staff to strictly adhere to the principles of impartiality and equidistance in accordance with Article 100 of the Charter. Attempts at a palace coup in the Secretariat, its privatization by a small group of countries, must not be allowed. The composition of the Secretariat should reflect the new realities and ensure the fair representation of the countries of the global majority. We look forward to a constructive discussion of the organization's development at a special meeting of the Security Council, which Russia, as president, plans to organize on United Nations Day on the 24th of October. UN reform is only a part of the complex task of transforming the entire system of global governance, including the genuine democratization of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, commensurate with the weight and role of the Global South and East in the world economy, trade, and finance. Discussions of global reforms cannot ignore the fact that the international security situation today is deteriorating. I have already spoken about the reasons for this, and I'll repeat that the main one is the desire to maintain hegemony through military force. More and more countries and regions are becoming involved in confrontational schemes. NATO is finding itself cramped in Europe and is penetrating into the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait, undermining the universal mechanisms of ASEAN and creating threats not only for China and Russia, but also for other countries that are located in the region. This new stage of expansion is justified by NATO leadership with the slogan of the indivisibility of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security, and they're trying to use this slogan to surround the whole of Eurasia with a military ring. Russia and its like-minded partners are offering a constructive alternative to this dangerous course, to build in Eurasia an architecture of equal and indivisible security, not just for NATO members and their allies, but for all countries and associations on the continent without exception, including the SCO, the CIS, ASEAN, the EAEU, CSTO, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and others. To this end, Belarus and Russia, as partners in the Union State, are proposing the development of a Eurasian Charter of Diversity and Multipolarity in the 21st century. A truly continent-wide process is unavoidable after the West's behavior has rendered the Euro-Atlantic security model based on NATO, the EU, and the OSCE meaningless. We see no prospects for restoring this model in Europe in its former form, as some European capitals have suddenly started to contemplate. When talking about the future, we must not forget the lessons of the past, especially in a situation where Nazism is rearing its head again in Europe and militarization is gaining momentum under the same anti-Russian slogans. This is all the more alarming given that a number of politicians in power in Brussels and in some capitals of EU and NATO countries are seriously beginning to talk about a third world war as a likely scenario. These figures are undermining any efforts to find a fair balance of interests among all of the members of the international community by trying to impose their unilateral approaches on everyone else in gross violation of the key charter requirement, which I have repeatedly mentioned already, that is the respect for the sovereign equality of states. It is this equality which is the foundation for the objectively emerging multipolarity. Russia is not agitating for revolution against anyone. Our country has suffered more than others from revolutions. We are simply calling on member states and the Secretariat's leadership to strictly adhere to all of the principles of the UN Charter without exception, without double standards. Only then will the legacy of the founding fathers of the UN not be squandered in vain. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I thank the Minister for Foreign of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Barilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, as we meet here, 2.2 million human beings in Gaza are condemned to hunger by the genocidal extermination and ethnic cleansing actions of the Zionist regime, which enjoys the military and financial supplies and the impunity guaranteed by the government of the United States. On behalf of the government and people of Cuba, I reiterate our firmest solidarity with the Palestinian people and with their just cause for freedom, independence, and an end to the Zionist occupation. If the Security Council proves itself impotent because of the veto that the United States wields or threatens to wield, and is incapable of adopting effective measures to halt the barbarity, then this General Assembly has the duty and the capacity to put forward concrete measures without delay. At the very least, it must unequivocally declare Palestine's right to be a UN member state within the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and with the right of refugees to return. 11 million people, 3 million of them children, die every year from hunger and associated diseases. The climate crisis is destroying nations and lives, devastating communities and economies. A handful of countries and individuals have amassed more wealth than the vast majority of all other countries combined. Colossal inequalities stifle and prevent sustainable development. There has been no effective global response to today's serious challenges. There could not be, because the current world order reflects a bygone era when most developing countries did not even exist as independent states. 80 years ago, the United Nations was founded with only 51 member states. Today, we are 193. The most urgent priority is to create a new international order that guarantees peace, the right to development, sovereign equality, participation and representation of developing countries in global policy decisions, that provides for the common good and prosperity in harmony with nature, and ensures the exercise of all human rights for all people. Let us aspire to a new civilized coexistence in which solidarity, international cooperation, and the peaceful settlement of disputes prevail as alternatives to war, the use of force, aggression, and occupation, opposed to unipolar domination and hegemonism. An order without blockades or universal coercive measures, based on multilateralism and full respect for the United Nations Charter and international law. Even with its limitations, the United Nations continues to be the most representative body of the international community. We have the duty to protect and strengthen it in its intergovernmental essence, in its democratic foundations that cannot be diluted into generalized agendas subject to arbitrary priorities and rules imposed by the largest funders. What we must do is emphasize the central role of the General Assembly as its most democratic and representative organ. The UN80 initiative, launched by the Secretary-General, must have as its main objective the strengthening of the intergovernmental nature of the United Nations and its capacity to better confront the urgent challenges of the present. We must reject the threatening proposal of a new doctrine that they call peace through strength, which is equivalent to imposing the arbitrary will of US imperialism on everyone through threat, coercion, and aggression. This is a doctrine conceived to satisfy the ambitions of a unipolar power already in decline, which, by the way, serves the interests of big transnational corporations at the cost of sovereign nations and their peoples, and to the cost of the values upon which this organization was founded. In the Caribbean, today we're seeing the looming threat of war, with an extraordinary naval and air deployment of an offensive nature, utterly unjustified, involving missiles, landing and assault craft, and nuclear submarines. Test missiles with nuclear capacity are being launched. The United States brandishes the pretext of fighting crime and drug trafficking. This is a tale which no one in this chamber believes. The attack and destruction of unidentified boats, the assassination or extrajudicial execution of civilians, the interception of fishing vessels, and aggressive actions by the United States generate a dangerous situation that violates international law, threatens peace and regional security. We reaffirm our energetic rejection of threats of aggression against Venezuela and our full support for the Bolivarian and Chavista government of this sister Latin American and Caribbean nation, and for the People's Military Union led by the legitimate President Nicolas Maduro Moros. We repudiate the Monroe Doctrine and any attempt at militarization, intervention, or imperialist domination in Latin America and the Caribbean, proclaimed as a zone of peace in 2014 in Havana, with the signatures of the heads of state and government of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. The accelerated arms race leads to competition in the field of death and destruction, employing extraordinary financial and material resources that could instead be dedicated to poverty alleviation, development, and cooperation. Meanwhile, most of the meagre goals of the 2030 agenda will not be met. Commitments of official development assistance are being ignored, and climate financing is decreasing. In 1960, before this very assembly, the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, stated, and I quote, "Eliminate the philosophy of plunder and the philosophy of war will disappear." Madam President, climate change is advancing inexorably and quickly. The first 6 months of this year have been the hottest ever recorded. Last year was already the hottest. From this very podium, science and decades of collective work to protect the planet are now being questioned. If we don't change the unsustainable production and consumption patterns of capitalism and address their root causes, then by 2030 we will surpass the fateful threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The external debt of developing countries, already paid several times over, continues to grow, accumulating astronomical interest as a new form of colonization. What we need to do is implement the commitments undertaken at the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, with additional resources and a specific multilateral mechanism for debt negotiation. We're suffering the consequences of powerful cultural domination in an era when digital technology increasingly impacts our lives across the board. A few transnationals, almost all of them from the US, impose their operating systems and control the content that is seen, read and heard, manipulating human behavior. We are suffering from the dictatorship of the algorithm. What we need to do is establish at the UN as soon as possible common norms in order to unlock the transformative potential of new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, for the benefit of all, whilst at the same time mitigating the risks. Beyond the challenges that Cuba faces as a small island developing state, our country suffers from the devastating and accumulated impact of the policy of hostility and economic suffocation that has been imposed by the United States for more than 6 decades. The blockade against Cuba persists and is being tightened to the extreme. It is really a comprehensive and prolonged economic war aimed at depriving Cubans of their livelihoods and sustainability, of their existence as a supportive, educated and joyful people. Anyone who claims otherwise deliberately lies. The very promoters of this war boast of its destructive effect and its ability to strike anywhere in the world and affect the standard of living of an entire people. The aggression has escalated to unprecedented levels in the last 8 years, including increasingly acts of persecution and economic pressure on third parties, the countries that you represent, and that increasingly are elaborate, surgical and extraterritorial in nature. They affect productive capacity and have commercial and financial effects, affecting services and policies that guarantee social justice and life itself. Today, Cuba faces a grave scenario of prolonged and daily blackouts, difficulties in affording food, insufficient availability of medicines, reduced public transport, limited community services, and pronounced inflation, which is eroding real incomes. In 1960, the US Undersecretary of State Lester Mallory drafted the infamous Memorandum of Coercion and Blockade against Cuba, and it is this that has guided US policy ever since, and currently governs the policy of the US. He wrote, and I quote, "All possible means must be promptly used to weaken the economic life of Cuba, a line of action that achieves the greatest progress in depriving Cuba of money and supplies, to reduce its financial resources and real wages, provoke hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." End of quote. The current Secretary of State of the United States is the reincarnation of that macabre figure. Madam President, Cuba is a country that is a victim of terrorism, and for decades we have been subject to state terrorism from the US. For years, and still today, terrorist acts against our country are organized and financed from US territory. And these people live here in total impunity, and they are recognized as perpetrators of horrendous acts of aggression against the Cuban people, causing thousands of deaths, mutilations, and significant material damage. In compliance with our counter-terrorism responsibilities and with UN efforts against this scourge, the Cuban government has officially shared with the US government in recent years the names and information relating to 62 individuals and 20 organizations based in this country who have been responsible for violent and terrorist acts and who continue from US territory participating in such acts against Cuba. No response has been received, nor is it known if the US authorities have taken any action against any of them. It is cynical that the US government, for purposes of political and economic coercion, labels Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, a slander not shared by this organization nor by any other of its member states. Many national institutions, both banking and financial as well as commercial, of nearly all the countries represented here, are intimidated by this false designation of the US government. And because of this, their banks very often avoid engaging with Cuban entities, offering us credit, supporting our commercial activity, or channeling our transfers. Added to this is intimidation against citizens of more than 40 countries whom the US government threatens with reprisals if they decide by right to visit Cuba. The United States has unleashed a virulent campaign of discreditation and persecution against Cuban Medical Corporation and of harassment and coercion against the authorities of countries that receive it. This is a strategy directed by the State Department directly. It seeks to disparage this cooperation which has saved millions of lives and, in many cases, has been the only option for access to healthcare for large population groups. This altruistic and supportive cooperation rests on entirely legitimate bilateral agreements and aligns fully with international standards of this organization in the field of cooperation, as it does with the standards of other organizations. I confirm once again that Cuba will maintain its commitments with all countries with which we have bilateral medical cooperation agreements and programs, and we will remain willing to expand them with all governments who are prepared to develop such cooperation, respecting international law, national legislation, and all of this for the well-being of their peoples. Since 1963, almost going back to that time of Mr. Mallory's declaration, 605,000 doctors from Cuba, doctors and specialists, have carried out in dozens of countries more than 17 million surgeries and brought more than 5 million children into the world. At this moment, over 24,000 health professionals provide services in 56 countries. The aggression against Cuba is reinforced by a powerful machinery of destabilization that, from US territory and with funding from that country's federal budget, mounts an offensive aimed at disturbing public order, promoting acts of violence, disorienting the population, and discrediting our country. It is a strategy of unconventional warfare that combines emotional manipulation with informational intoxication in order to impose an atmosphere of despair and political demobilization. Faced with such an asymmetric onslaught, our people's determination is strengthened. We are aware of the great challenges that we face and of the need to direct with creativity and with everyone's contribution economic recovery and the strengthening of social policies. Last July, President Miguel Díaz-Canel said, and I quote, "We are not an accident of history. We are the logical consequence of a history of resistance and rebellion against abuse and injustice." End of quotation. We will not desist in our effort to build our dreams of a socialist country, better and more prosperous for all, based on the constitutional order chosen freely by our people, guaranteeing sovereignty, national and cultural identity, and reflecting the dream of José Martí, summarized in his memorable aspirations, and I quote, "The worship by Cubans of man's full dignity and to conquer all justice." We have designed a realistic program of economic recovery which is adapted to the very particular and extraordinary conditions of our country, aware as we are that we must overcome the devastating impacts of the economic blockade, correct the deficiencies of the current economic structure, and, I quote, "change everything that must be changed." We don't have any illusions, but results are already beginning to be felt at the macroeconomic level, although they have not yet been reflected in daily life for families. Cuba is a nation of peace. Despite all of the harm that the United States has and continues to inflict upon us, We have always been willing to engage in dialogue without preconditions and to attempt to move toward a respectful and civilized relationship with that country without subordination or limits on our sovereign prerogatives. Both peoples would benefit from that opportunity. A considerable number of Cubans live here in the United States, many of whom today feel threatened, having been vilely betrayed by politicians, especially in Miami, who have built careers and enriched themselves by supposedly representing them. With the constant sowing of hatred and political manipulation, these politicians are now opportunistically supporting xenophobic, racist and repressive measures of intimidation and reprisals unjustly applied against them. This is happening particularly in the State Department. We must not forget that the vast majority of Cubans came to this country over more than 60 years ago. They were driven by the conditions created by the blockade, and they were attracted by politically motivated laws and practices of stimulus, reception and protection, regardless of whether they emigrated regularly or not. Madam President, we reaffirm our commitment as a partner of country of BRICS. We reject the application of unilateral coercive measures which are intended to subjugate the sovereign will of peoples. We express our support for Belarus, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Iran, Russia, and other nations victimized by them. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Government of Reconciliation and National Unity of Nicaragua. We reiterate our support for the inalienable right of the people of Puerto Rico to self-determination and independence. The sister nations of the Caribbean deserve fair and differentiated treatment as well as reparations for the horrors of colonialism and slavery. The international community bears great responsibility toward the Haitian people. We maintain our modest cooperation in health with this brotherly country, and Cuba will join any international effort to support it, based on respect for its sovereignty without imposition or military intervention. We support Argentina's legitimate and sovereign right over the Malvinas Islands, South Sandwich Islands, South Georgia Islands, and the surrounding maritime areas. Cuba remains committed to peace in Colombia, and we feel solidarity with President Gustavo Petro today. Africa, the cradle of humanity, will always be able to count on Cuba and the solidarity of Cubans. We support its just claim for reparations for the damage of colonization. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Sahrawi people and their right to self-determination. We reaffirm our support for the One China principle. We oppose NATO's aggressive military and nuclear doctrines. We firmly believe, without utopia, that a better world is possible. We believe it is our duty to struggle and work to achieve it. I reiterate the words of President Raúl Castro Ruz, spoken from this podium in September 2015, and I quote, "The international community will always be able to count on Cuba's sincere voice against injustice, inequality, underdevelopment, discrimination, and manipulation, and for the establishment of a more just and equitable international order centred truly on the human being, their dignity and well-being. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
We were live to the United Nations General Assembly on its fifth day of debates with the stances of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, also Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, both of whom centered their stances and demanded freedom for Palestine, the lifting of unilateral sanctions imposed by Western powers, the withdrawal as well of U.S. military ships from the Caribbean, and in general the multidimensional crisis that is being faced by humanity, which cannot be solved in an isolated manner but through unity and multilateralism. This is all for the moment, but stay tuned with teleSUR English for more.